Hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this final NCLA event of the summer season. My name is John Challis, a poet and researcher at Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts within the School of English Literature, Language, Linguistics at Newcastle University, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this event. Before we begin, I'd just like to express my gratitude on behalf of NCLA to everyone who has attended an event this semester, which have featured novelists, non-fiction writers, poets and screenwriters, including Niven Govindan, Natasha Pulley, Dashana Doshi, Cortia Newland, Jen Hadfield and John McGregor. You can recap and catch up on all of our events via NCLA's YouTube channel or on our online archive, which you'll find at archive.nclacommunity.org. Details of our autumn series of events will be available online towards the end of the summer at ncl.ac.uk/NCLA, where you can also sign up to receive our newsletter. I'd like to give a special thanks to Melanie Birch for managing this semester's events, and to Peter Hebden, who has expertly steered NCLA through the age of Zoom and YouTube. I'm now going to introduce the host for this evening's New Defences of Poetry event. David O'Hanlon Alexandra is a poet critic based in Newcastle upon Tyne. His poems have appeared widely in magazines and journals, including the Rialto, Acumen and Poetry Wales. His debut pamphlet was Brut, published by V Press in 2015, and his first full collection, History, by Valley Press, was published the following year. He is an AHRC funded PhD candidate at Newcastle University, researching a thesis on literary criticism written by Romantic era poets, and he is the creator and editor of the New Defences of Poetry project. So please join me in welcoming David.
Hi there, good evening. Welcome to the launch of New Defences of Poetry, a publication which celebrates 200 years since the composition of Percy Bysshe Shelley's seminal essay, A Defence of Poetry. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be an interesting, insightful evening discussing poetry and poetics. So this has been a fun and exciting project, and I'm really excited to share with you the 31 pieces that have been contributed. They make for a powerful, provocative, challenging, moving and inspiring conversation about poetry. The website is now live, and I believe there is a link to the website in the comments section of this video. So please do check it out, read and reread and engage with the pieces, share them on social media, and please do keep up the conversation. I see this as the beginning of a new conversation, not the end of it. Tonight, I'm delighted to say that I'll be joined by 3 of the contributors, Philip Gross, Olivia McCannon and Robert Shepherd. They will each give a short reading from their essays, and then that will be followed by some discussion on their pieces, on poetics, and on the legacy of Shelley's defence. So let's get started. The first speaker is Philip Gross. Philip has published 25 collections for adults and children, including The Water Table, which won the T.S. Eliot Prize, Love Songs of Carbon, winner of the Roland Matthews Poetry Award, and most recently Between the Islands, all from Blood Axe Books. He's a keen collaborator and has produced books of artists, scientists, and other poets. His contribution to New Defences is on the subject of listening, an echo of his poetry on the sounds of water and silence, and on the nature of voice. I'll pass you over to Philip.
Thank you very much. This is about half of words listening, but I think it gives the outline. Poetry is just a word. As such, it holds whatever meanings cultures have attached to it. This includes our often peevish differences about what real or true poetry may or may not be. The word contains them all. It is a resonant room, impartial listening. The first misstep is trying to confine it to a definition. Think of it rather as a concourse bustling with the meanings that have crowded through, from epic war songs to psalms to courtly sonnets to gangster rap to haiku almost vanishing on their own breath, concrete poetry, found poems, poems deconstructing their own language, not to mention poems of erasure, where it's the spaces between words that speak. Poetry is impartial as to who comes to inhabit it. A Bosnian war criminal or a Zen monk can be a poet equally. I'm often disturbed by how many poets who've moved me also held opinions with which I strongly disagree, because poetry can be a vehicle for any attitude, any disposition a human being can voice. All these voices, all these echoes quivering in the air of what seems, from the outside, quite a tiny room. A poem doesn't have to be beautiful or good or wise, it just has to be more so. Poetry is everything the human voice can do, but more intensely to more memorable effect. I don't mean it has to be loud or forceful. Quietness, but more so, is one gift of poetry. There is an unease at the heart of poetry, an art form that relies on community, a shared agreement on how to receive it, yet seems to breed disagreements about what that agreement should be. You could say, this is an unserviceably baggy word, abolish it, coin new words for each discrete kind of word art. Or you could say, the contradictions are its constant dynamic. This is a difference engine, a source of friction and of energy. Better to talk maybe not about what poetry is, but about what it can be, the opportunities it affords. If the range of that seems hugely various and contradictory, well, maybe that's because the same is true of us. The room is simply listening. Is this starting to sound like bland permissiveness? Everything's a style choice. You simply hang out with the friends you choose. But the world around us is a more contentious place than that. We bring our differences, our inequalities, our out of kilterness with us into the resonant room. There have been periods when the surrounding culture seems so conformable, the powers that keep it in place so dominant as to be unspoken, as for there to be no argument. No audible argument, that is. In other times, and ours is surely one of them, there seems nothing but dissension, as in the brooding political build-up of the 1930s or writing under a totalitarian regime. The question in the air is, which side are you on? In a world of oppositional politics, the argument for poetry should be not that it can serve as a weapon for the side I side with, though it can. The gift of poetry and its challenge is that its still small voice can help us see beyond our own agreements, to hear a facet of experience that's true for someone else, even or especially someone we disagree with, on that level where thoughts and feelings crystallize into opinions. The same goes for writing as for reading. I hope not to judge the poetry I write by whether or not it fulfills my own intentions or accords with my political morality, but whether it has a life of its own and can surprise me by what it has to say. Whatever the kind of poetry I choose, on any given day, I also want other kinds to exist. I might not like them, but I want there to be visceral rants and sentimental self-indulgences. I want to live in a world that's large enough to contain many places where I don't go. At best, poetry, like good science, always doubts itself. It offers its findings to be tested against other later experiments. I hope for a poetry that is always, to some extent, agnostic about itself, that still has faith in itself, but faith is not the same thing as beliefs, still less a creed. I hope for a poetry that should refuse to be summed up or in the service of any manifesto, this one included. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Okay, we'll move on to our second speaker. The speaker is Robert Shepherd. Robert is a poet critic whose most recent books are The English Strain, published by Shearsman, and Bad Idea, published by Knives, Forks and Spoons Press. They are the first two parts of an ongoing project called The English Strain, which explores the Brexit coronavirus bunglings by rewriting and translating poems within the English sonnet tradition. He has written widely on the subject of poetics, what he calls the writings writers write about writing, and his contribution to New Defences is an exciting continuation of that exploration. I'll pass you over to Robert.
Hello. I'm going to read from my piece, which is called Shifting and Imaginary, Poetics and Anticipation. And it's probably like Philip's, it's about half of it. It consists of a distillation of longer notes written about a year ago, actually. And they are very much the middle of that stuff that we were in. A more compassionate world, inspired by the great sacrifices of NHS frontline staff? Or a crueler world of people, some people more than others, sacrificed to the greater good? Dominic Cummings, few pensioners. The governor of Texas, improbable opinion that there are more important things than living. Not levelling up, but whacking down. We could be drunk with open-mindedness at this point, as Louis Aragon puts it. After the hungry years, the drowning years, the age of irony, war and terror, the age of immiseration, a hope for a worldlier world, one more ecologically fragile, but fluid, worldlier in its inter and outer nationalism. I'm transfigured into a bigger idea, shifting an imaginary where I'll remain for all eyes to behold, in the valetudinary words of Idea. That's the last words of my Bad Idea rewritings of Drayton's Idea. In that poem, a lowercase bigger idea in opposition to a singular capitalized big idea. In the world, the smaller the ideas are, the more focused they become, doable, durable. Neurologically speaking, writes Leanne Rorapor, I would suggest challenge a reader's perceptions, assumptions, modes of thinking, preconceived histories and ideologies. Foster attentiveness to language, to others, to the surrounding world. Create new neural pathways in the brain in lieu of neural ruts developed in response to sociocultural cliches. Blah, 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 media voices saying poetry must be harnessed to the restorative necessities of the post-COVID world. One big assumption there, as if compensation is what art offers, like a negligent government department. Art's formal splinter, its promise of a partly uncontrollable aesthetic encounter, may not necessarily yield a positive or therapeutic response. Utopia that embodies our hopes lies beyond any representation. Hope is the opposite of security, Ernst Bloch hopes. It is an anticipatory consciousness, a creative forward dream, but a lucid one, in opposition to the constructions of blueprint utopianism. Blueprint utopians. Put in these terms, it is almost enough, it is never enough. Poetics, as a luminous phrase, a catalytic particle, less a slogan or a buzzword than a koan. Poetics is another anticipatory activity. I've hitherto called it speculative, but is it not better thought of as anticipatory? That has me sitting at the edge of my seat, alert, speculative, sinking back into 1,000 cushions. We need to defend rights that have no ground to them, other than recognise common humanity, the human covenant. Boosterism is the poetry of Brexit. Political ideas, to work as poetry, have to be registered corporeally on the human frame, with its anguished and ecstatic voice, as in the writing of Sean Bonney. 2020, Steve Hansen states, whether we like it or not, is the start of an acutely painful transformation of the world, poised against a libertarian conservative clique, aided by capitalist realism. Now we witness a planned economy of crisis, notional socialism, as I call it. Hansen quotes Will Davies as counterclaim. Utopia is something that emerges among all of us as a need in the shape of some lack. Legepa quotes Levitas. Concrete utopia is anticipatory rather than compensatory. It reaches forward to a real future that involves not merely wishful, but willful thinking. It's not that the exploratory motion of writing, the feeling that all writing is improvised, is itself directly utopian. It is that this mode of making shares its anticipatory vectors with the anticipatory consciousness of utopian aspiration, the pulse with the impulse. The utopian moment, Norman Finkelstein is quoted from his book, The Utopian Moment, stands revealed in that very moment when the text most strenuously resists thematic or interpretive closure. And formal closure, I'd say, as the author of The Meaning of Form, and liberation of the said in the saying, I'd add, as the author of The Poetry of Saying. I hang out inside these sonnets, punching echoes into new shape, because I take poetry as the investigation of complexity through the means of form. I sing as the poet of Bad Idea, one of my 3 books of transpositions of sonnets from the British standard tradition, my English strain project you've just heard about, the third part of which is working through romantic poets, including our Shelley. Transposition, in preference to translation, is borrowed from Rosie Bredetti in her musicological derivation. It's an in-between space of zigzagging and of crossing, non-linear and chaotic. These poems are new shapes until they become old shapes. Then I shall anticipate other forms. A listening happens after saying. I cannot say what comes next, and I'm saying it now.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that. So next we'll move on to Olivia. Olivia McCannon is a poet and translator. Her translations of French poetry have been regularly published in Modern Poetry and Translation, and her books include Exactly My Own Length, published by Carcanet, which won the Fenton Aldeburgh First Collection Prize, and a translation of Balzac's Old Man Goriot for Penguin Classics. Emerging from her work on the multi-voiced and co-authored nature of translation, Olivia's new defense explores ownership of what she calls many-mouthed poems. I'll pass you over to Olivia.
Hello, good evening. Thanks so much for that introduction, and it's great to be here, hearing all the fantastic defences that we've just heard. So I'm going to start in the thick with mine. So I'm just quickly, as David said, I'm exploring ideas of ownership. Who owns poetry? Is it a resource? If so, what kind? I'm interested in thinking about whether poetry is the rarefied product of individual genius or a multitudinous cooperative energy that might not be exclusively human. And could poetry conceived in this way be capable of defending itself rather than being in need of protection? A defense of poetry, ownership, and the cooperating mind. In his defense of poetry, Shelley writes of poems of whatever nature or age as episodes to that great poem, which all poets, like the cooperating thoughts of one great mind, have built up since the beginning of the world. Shelley's gesture gathers in the poets he can't yet see, the poets whose languages he doesn't read. 200 years on, many women have spent many years expressing and asserting the variegated female presence and agency at work within that great creative mind. Along with many within, without society or within, without empire, occulted voices speaking out and writing for change. All at work in the cooperating mind of poetry. The mind needs them all to be itself, to be an autonomous, generative force, accumulating new matter and dimensionality with each successive reimagining or rejoining. If, as Shelley writes, this great mind has existed forever, if, as I want to understand it, he has creation itself in his sights, with poetry as a microcosmic speck of that greater principle, then this vision is able to take in pre-human incarnations of life, going back to the beginning of the world. That is, the explosive, expansive, fusional and relational forces of the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago still rippled through the form of poetry as displaced relic radiation. I'm reading with 21st century goggles. So this also leaps out at me. We want the creative faculty to imagine that which we know. We want the generous impulse to act that which we imagine. We want the poetry of life. Our calculations have outrun conception. We have eaten more than we can digest. We have eaten more than we can digest in ways that no human could have fully envisaged 200 years ago. Shelley's speculative powers detect the logic and the outcomes of various sites of social non-evolution and injustice. We want, as in lack, but we can also want this, the poetry of life. Better to own this than to own calculations, than to be owned by the economy, to stake everything on the wrong question or questionee. As the voice of reason from Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future inquires, do you ask your calculator what to do with your life, other lives? What role for poetry now, when human being in the world is unthinkable without connecting what is within to what is beyond the fictional walls of a body or mind? In the 2020s, this includes the machines and algorithms and systems to which humans have abdicated moral responsibility and accountability. It also includes the unknowable by a single human, hyper-objective convulsions of a world which is pristine nowhere, not even at the bottom of the Mariana Trench or in deepest Alaska. All life forms, all bodies are porous and implicated. Geopolitical and economic asymmetries and injustices already have made, some humans and beings on Earth more vulnerable than others. The global is nested in the local, the macro in the micro. What role for poetry when, as US poet Joelle McSweeney writes, every instant, every cell is the site of the Anthropocene crisis? McSweeney defends poetry from being lined up and shot down for what it can't do, i.e. change the world in a single grand gesture, and instead draws attention powerfully and movingly to its strength, its capacity to make change on a small immediate scale, to its adequacy as itself. McSweeney, just as this catastrophe consists of micro actions, poems may radiate their effects on micro scales. And it's on this micro scale on which change, or its more common manifestation, damage, occurs all the time, all around us. Damage proliferating, poetry proliferating, poetry made of poems owned by its own cooperating and corroding action of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Yes, thank you to all three of you. It's really sort of interesting to hear you sort of read them, because I mean, they're things that I've been sort of reading over and over and and editing and you know getting ready for the website. So it's really fascinating to hear the way you speak them. So I'm going to ask sort of a few questions now. Some I'll put to you individually, and others for the group. Also, if people want to have their own questions, please type them in on YouTube, and hopefully I'll be able to ask one or two of them towards the end. So yeah, please get involved. So to start with, I was going to ask Robert a question. You've written widely on the subject of poetics, and I wanted to ask about the relationship between your writings about poetry and the writing of your own poetry. Do you see your poetics as being sort of a supplement to your poetry, or an extension of it, or even an inseparable part of it?
But there's also another bit where I'm writing literary criticism as well. So that's a separate activity which I'm straying onto a bit there. But no, I'm very interested in the speculative, or as I now want to call it, anticipatory discourse that poets use when they write, in inverted commas, about what they write, because some of that might be not public, it might not actually be written. And I'm kind of curious about it. That I think that a lot of those kinds of documents, not so sure about Shelley's defense, actually, rereading it recently, as sometimes sort of read as like, as though it were quirky literary criticism, or literary criticism by people who can't quite do it, or to not see that there is a strange kind of element in poetics, where a writer might actually be completely kidding themselves about what they're doing to enable them to get into the situation where they can do something else. And so it becomes quite interesting and quite difficult to read it. And so I am I suppose it came out of my own desire to do that. I suppose this is a lockdown thing, but I'm rereading through old notebooks and things right back to the 1980s, and I've got lots and lots of attempts to try and define what I thought was going on. Sometimes more generally, but most often poetics from myself, talking to myself, perhaps in my own language, to get it going. But there's an intimate, but it's a disconnect. It's a loose relationship. It can never be. Blueprints. It's all what do I call it? A luminous phrase, catalytic particles, that sort of thing. So that it's got to remain mobile, suggestive, maybe even got to be contradictory in some ways to keep it loose, to keep it going. Otherwise, you end up making quite definitive statements, as I have in this piece. Funnily enough, boosterism is the poetry of Brexit. Is pretty kind of clear, but that is in relation to a whole series of poems that you mentioned earlier.
Thank you for that. Thank you. So Philip, I'm going to address a question to you now. So in your email to me, you said that writing in prose wasn't your usual method of thinking. And so I was wondering, having written a piece in prose, do you find that new ideas were brought forward that were changed, or sort of were the opposite of what you'd previously thought when you were thinking in poetry?
I think I needed to go to some lengths to stop myself thinking what I was writing was an academic essay. I know that's a form which I can do, but I know it engages only one slice of my brain. So the fact that it comes in numbered points of almost old-fashioned Twitter length, and I've written poems which pretend to be in that form as well. So I cheated to the extent that I was nudging towards the place where it feels as though more of me comes online. I read Shelley, and the part I absolutely love is when, regardless of the length of the lines on the page, he's writing poems. When he's talking about the wind blowing over and leaving ripples in the sand. I buy that more as an image of what's going on in the process than a whole lot of his abstractions about the absolutes of truth and beauty and even pleasure. But I realize that my only preference in this is I think we should each think in the mode that makes us feel most fully alive, that can use most of us at the same time. Did I think I've said anything different in this article? I probably wouldn't have been saying it at all if I hadn't been asked a good question. It needed to be part of a conversation. It needs to be part of this evening. You know, it's not an opinion that stands on its own, and it doesn't want to. So, I mean, it's meant to be here in this virtual room, in this hour.
Excellent, yeah. That was something that's really kind of, when editing the pieces together, and I hope people sort of will see it in reading them, is how these pieces really do sort of talk to each other, and there are the same concerns, same kind of beliefs, and also that difference. Yeah, no, thank you. So on that point, on the sort of multiplicity of it, I was going to ask Olivia. You wrote about the multitudinous nature of poetry, of sort of the many poems and the many mouths, and even of the idea of poetries in plural. Do you feel that that's part of that is about seeing across divides, sort of like what Philip said in his piece, and that there are sort of that poetry is another type of discourse that has to be separate from other discourses?
I think the idea of multitudinous is just that I feel that there needs in the world today to be cooperative spaces. I feel that we really need this. You know, I think the Anthropocene sort of field of inquiry is questioning assumptions, is finding new frameworks, new structures, breaking open systems, you know, revealing asymmetries and injustices. And I think that the multitudinous, I think that poetry doesn't work unless it is, I mean, as the other fantastic speakers have said this evening, you know, unless it has this kind of openness and sort of complexity and is full of conflicting and clashing and meeting encounters in poetry.
Yes, again, yeah, and again, that is something that sort of comes out throughout this project, the idea of needing a space for conversation, and to sort of Philip's idea about listening. And so Philip, I was going to ask, because I associate your poetry a lot with sort of sound and listening, so the sounds of water, the sounds of silence, and the nature of voice. I was wondering, so do you have any understanding of how or why sound and listening became so central to your poetic thinking that it became the basis for your defense?
Possibly a very personal answer would be that growing up as a child with an extremely bad stammer, I was just very aware of silence and the spaces between words as being certainly a thing with a force of its own. And I've spent most of my adult life learning that that was only one of the hundreds of values and dialects of silence. You know, in my adult life, I think and worship as a Quaker. I find out more about my father's Estonian background, and the Estonians have a famously inward and reticent, apparently, culture which values silence and listening very much. And as a writer, absolutely buying the thought that whatever we write, whatever we speak, only becomes fully what it is in the act of listening or reading at the other end. So it's always cooperation or collaboration, if you can take the historic negative meanings out of that. At some point in the evening, I wouldn't mind asking both Olivia and Robert whether you see any distinction between the words cooperation and collaboration, and different grades of those things, different kind of deepnesses of absorption in each other. But sorry, I mustn't ask that in a way that anticipates an answer.
Yes, I can open that to either of you.
Can I say one more thing on that briefly? The person whose definitions I'm thinking of, and quite an influential book about collaboration, is Vera John Steiner. And she has a map of more and more integrative kinds of collaboration from one end of the spectrum, where you each remain entirely yourself, but you agree to contribute different elements to a whole work, to a point like in visual art. She thought of the early Cubist moment when Braque and Picasso were painting so closely in and around each other, and so excited by what they were finding out about Cubism that you could scarcely tell which of them was which. Sorry, and all kinds of personal sweet spots we might find between those extremes.
So, Robert and Olivia, do you have any thoughts on collaboration and cooperation? Or
should have, having just written an article on literary collaborations, but I'm just kind of thinking about its difference with cooperation. Cooperation feels more like me as though it's in the political and social field, whereas collaboration would be much more in the artistic and or personal. Whether they are on a scale, I don't know. I mean, I would be interested to follow up on that lead there from Philip, but you know, I think collaboration would be possibly the making of one. I'd see that as the making of maybe of one artifact, whereas cooperation might be, you know, it might be where Braque and Picasso work separately. They could still be cooperating, but they will be collaborating on one entity, I suppose. But both of those things might also involve something Olivia was interestingly saying about, you know, working on the micro scale. I think that's coming up. That's coming up in our discussion here.
Yes, well, it's so interesting that you say that. I think, I suppose I come at this as a translator, really. I don't really understand, in a way I can't really understand the words and the terms, but when I think of translation, which I suppose you could conceive of as a kind of collaboration or cooperative activity, for me, when I translate a poem, it's like a kind of a meshing of the DNA. You know, it's a kind of, it's such an intimate process. It is at the cellular level that you are combining, that you are meshing and relating to that work. I just think it's such an important practice, actually, for our times, that translation, the act of translating a poem, I sort of see it as an art of living on a damaged planet, the way that it can reveal relation and also create relation, as you said, at this very cellular level.
Yeah, thank you for that. So while we're on the subject of translating, do you feel a strong need to sort of conceptualize your practice? You know, I think of that, you know, there's decisions you have to be making. Do you find yourself doing that, or do you need to enter into another poet's conceptualization of that practice? If that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my belief is that that literary translators are writers and should be considered that way. So I don't see any difference between making a poem and a translation. There's a critical expectation that surrounds the translation of a poem, that it should be read in a certain way. But I do think that poems are equally related to other poems and other works, but they're just not visibly explored as such. So that's what makes translation so interesting, that it's this kind of, you know, showing and making visible, I think. For me, what excites me about translation is there's the French-Canadian poet Nicole Brossard calls translation a new genre of the impossible, as our return journeys from the worlds of imagination and fiction to those of reality always have been and still are. And I think that's a really wonderful description of a wonderful art form.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll open out. I have a question more to anybody who wants to answer. So thinking about sort of the legacy of Shelley's defence, I keep thinking about that line in Mask of Anarchy, which, you know, ye are many, they are few, which somehow sort of 200 years later became the, you know, the slogan for Jeremy Corbyn's political campaign. And I think that's a kind of strange sort of legacy, and almost potentially legislation altering legacy. I'm just wondering what kind of legacy we might feel that Percy Shelley's writing has. Do any of his ideas still hold particular weight, or do you think we've moved on maybe from his way of thinking? This is I'm sorry, open to anybody.
In terms of the defence, I would say that you know, one powerful work creates a momentum which ripples through all ages and times, and he opened a space for similar. I mean, his wasn't the first defence, obviously, and there've been many since. But it's amazing to read them all. You know, I expect, including those that, you know, your project has brought forth. I think there's I really, in terms of a legacy, I mean, I think, you know, I think there's that, what was it he says? He says, poetry is a sword of lightning, ever unsheathed, which consumes the scabbard that would contain it. I mean, I think that's a kind of really brilliant system-breaking aspiration I would sort of carry with me. And I love his sense that humans need to imagine to be good, you know, to be good people. So I think there's masses of amazing stuff in there. I like his decentering as well. That when he talks about the what is it? He says, the great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our own nature, an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, and person, not our own, which kind of relates to some of what's been said this evening as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was reading it again, and I was, I mean, I think what we do is we cherry pick from it, don't we? So Olivia's picked some of the more resonant phrases there. We pick out things on, you know, he seemed to have defined defamiliarization, you know, centuries before Shlovsky, and you know, defining that idea of the, you know, the mind as the coal burning. But it also has sentences like, poetry is the record of the best and happiest moments of the happiest and best minds, and poetry turns all things to loveliness, which we probably, you know, we're not going to cherry pick those, are we? So it's an interesting document to read, and I've never been sure about, you know, the unacknowledged legislators of the world. They sound that to me, probably with my obsession with these poems I've been writing, that sounds like Dominic Cummings to me, rather than the poets. But you know, there are, and I was thinking, well, maybe really it's just a wonderful exemplar of how you might think about poetry. And then I thought about the mind and the burning coal, and I thought, well, hang on, that's a bit weird, because contrary to my previous experience of writing, where I'm now taking a previously existing romantic poem, as I say, Shelley is included, and sort of doing versioning it, I am working in that frantic way, and it is being done, or was being done. Finished the stuff now, you know, basically over in an hour, and I'm putting it on my blog, and I'm doing a little video of it, me reading it, and it's and I tweet about it, and 30 people have read it, and I leave it up for a week, and so maybe that's the modern version of that. But there is something else, of course, which of course this is, because he keeps going off on digressions, but we digress, and he keeps coming back to Peacock's original essay, which I know I read years and years ago, The Four Ages of Poetry, which is, you know, basically it is a utilitarian argument against the works of the imagination, and this has a terribly contemporary resonance. Olivia didn't read the bit in her paper where she was talking about poetry in the national curriculum and keeping poetry at arm's length. I mean, I think the danger is poetry is going to be much further than arm's length and off the agenda. You know, Fatima's next job is going to be in cyber because there isn't going to be a dancing school. You know, I think we're living in a new age of that, and probably, you know, we need another. Maybe it's a defense of the imagination rather than of poetry, because after all, his Shelley's definition of poetry is not of a it's not simply what you find in poems. You know, he's finding them in other writers and in other qualities of life, which I think makes it difficult to read. But it is a defense that we do need perhaps to make. I agree with Olivia that poetry perhaps doesn't need defending, but perhaps the imagination or arts education does, without a doubt.
That's a sort of a familiar kind of recurring statement throughout actually these defences is, you know, does poetry need defending, and that maybe there are just kind of aspects of the art that need defending. So like the way it's taught to the young people particularly, and the sort of the cultivation of it. But yeah, Shelley's definition of poetry basically it just is all art, isn't it? I think it's purely all imaginative works. And yeah, I like how you kind of draw that out. I'm sorry, Philip, were you going to say something there?
It's a bit hard to get back beyond about 100 years in which his arguments became a kind of aesthetic orthodoxy, to find out, to remember that they were radical when he was expressing them, and to ask which parts of them come back and are kind of usefully, creatively unsettling for us now. I'd agree that the absolutes of truth and beauty and goodness and virtue and happiness, most of us can manage without. But one thing which stuck with a nice little itch in the corner of my mind is that he is offering a concept of this thing broadly called poetry as being answerable to something we, the writers, don't completely control, plan, or intend. You know, I think all of us who write have had that experience, which I think Robert mentioned there, where a thing just lifts off and is talking with its own voice. You can see how that gets mythologized as muse or whatever, and most of us will step back from that and say, no, well, no. But being answerable to something which is, you know, its own huge collaborative life, which I think Olivia talked about, as distinct from market or taste or even morals. So that's interesting in an age when we're coming back into a stricter political moralism than we've had for quite a while. And I say that, you know, I would agree with most of the things we are becoming more moralistic about, but where does that leave us as writers? How does this being answerable to the poem's own life leave us in a world where our words and our motives are going to be quite strictly scrutinized in terms of our emerging morality? Which side are we on?
So I don't want to come in on that point exactly, but something you were talking about previously, Philip, this idea that I think you were referring to the idea of the repositioning, if you like, of the human, and I think this is for me the take home from the work that I've done here on the defence, that is that, you know, some groups of humans are finding that they don't occupy the same position that they did before, and I think that can go even further, and we can say that humans themselves need to become aware of the fact that we're no longer doing Holocene thinking, that humans are not at the center of everything, that it's not anthropocentric, that, you know, so this was what I was trying to get at in my defense, was that if poetry is connected to creation and life, then it is a defense of that creation and life, not just of human creation and life. And that's the direction that I want to take my poetry in. And I've spent the past decade rethinking why on earth I would write poems in a country acid stripped by its leaders, on an irreversibly damaged planet, during the 6th mass extinction, in a language contaminated by the ecocides and necropolitical atrocities that have been committed in its name, and which leave their mark on its structures like so many mind traps. And I suppose I was really grateful for your brief, David. You know, this was a really useful sort of focus for these ideas that I've been working on through my poetry, and the questions that I have only questions really, and all the work is geared towards exploring those questions.
So sorry, Philip. No. So do you find sort of that, is it that thing that Ian Forster said, that you write in order to know what you think? Do you feel that that's
I felt I had only questions, and I felt I could no longer read the world, never mind speak it. And I needed to make terms with English. I felt very conflicted and uncomfortable writing in this language. I should say that also coincided, I lived in France for 10 years previously to that, and I came back to England and found myself back in English and sort of feeling a bit strange in it. And so, yes, so sorry, could you repeat your question, David? It slipped out of my head what you actually asked.
Oh, I was just asking whether you find that kind of E.M. Forster notion that you write to know what you think. I was wondering if that was what you were getting at in your last sort of comment.
I think that's a really beautiful phrase, and yeah, I think it always helps, doesn't it, to write and explore and experiment and seek to understand, even if there are no answers.
So yeah, so one question actually I wanted to ask all three of you to answer is: are there prose writings by poets that you would that really sort of are important to you, or that you would want to sort of recommend to sort of people, and that kind of really help you think through poetry? Anybody want to go first on that? You want to think about it?
I've just been speaking, but I'm sorry, I'm back. Yes, absolutely. I absolutely love Muriel Rucase's The Life of Poetry, which kind of replies to the poetry of life, I think. And I think it's absolutely staggeringly brilliant document. I also have found Ivan Boland's Object Lessons a really important work as well. And the French-Canadian poet Lucie Bersianic, who I'm translating at the moment, she has written amazing essays as well. She was part of the 1970s literary and feminist avant-garde in Quebec. Those have been really eye-opening. And I also really love the writings of Domi Che on translation, absolutely stunning.
Thank you. Philip, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure that I can list people who've written about poetics, but I'm thinking of the way Anne Carson occupies a nicely uncomfortable but fascinating place on the borders of poetry and prose and scholarship, in my mind. I value people like her who are always making those little sideways moves just when you think you've got them pinned down.
Yes, yeah. For me, Anne Carson's one of the sort of great academic poets, isn't it? And it's a kind of, I don't know how to describe it. I think that doesn't do it justice to call it that. what I just said, but yeah, that kind of leaning between the disciplines is and bringing it all together in a way that isn't forbidding and that isn't off-putting, and it's I'm a big admirer of Anne Carson's as well.
Yeah.
How about you, Robert?
Well, yes, the Muriel Rukase, I've read parts of that. Is absolutely terrific. My mind's sort of gone blank, so I pulled from the shelf the anthology of poetry and poetics that I co-edited with James Byrne, Atlantic Drift, and we forced people at gunpoint, if they hadn't written some poetics, to accompany their poems, and we've got some great pieces by people from Charles Bernstein and Robert Fitterman, Forrest Gander and Badu Capel and Nathaniel Mackie, D.S. Marriott, Geraldine Monk, Roseby Wardrop, Zoe Scalding, all kinds of people. There's just actually so much out there, really. I do but there's not one thing. There's not one thing I would say go to. I'm just confused by overload there, and possibly heat. Yeah, I'm overheated.
Okay, then I think might be time to sort of wrap things up. I just want to say huge thank you to the three guests, Philip, Robert, and Olivia. Also to John Chalice, Melanie Birch, and Pete Hebden, who are doing all the behind-the-scenes work for this event. Thank you to everyone that's joined us here tonight. And of course, to all the contributors to New Defences of Poetry. It's been an absolute pleasure to work on this project, and I hope you get as much sort of joy and inspiration from these essays as I have. So this is the end of the NCLA programme for the academic year. The programme for events and courses in the autumn-winter semester will become available on the NCLA website in September. A huge thank you to everyone who has come to the events across the year and continue to support the Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts across, what's been a difficult year. And we hope to see you at future events and hopefully in person. Yes, thank you to all, and once again, thank you to Philip Ross, Robert Shepherd, and Olivia McCallan. Okay, good night.